Bonjour and welcome back to Bloomera Podcast. Or should I say, your Bloomera. I'm your host, Brienne, and in today's episode, I sit down with Lola Reed Allin, a trailblazing pilot who shattered barriers in a male-dominated world of aviation. As the first female flight instructor at 2 flight schools, the first woman to fly the Twin Otter for a scheduled air service, and a pilot commemorated on the Wall of Women in Aviation History, Lola knows firsthand what it takes to rise in an industry that wasn't built for her success. She shares 5 tips with us to succeed in a male-dominated industry, as well as the challenges she faced as a female pilot, from breaking into flight training to navigating power and control dynamics in aviation, where women are often underestimated. But this conversation goes beyond flying. We explore gender inequality in society, how media, toys, and early childhood messaging shape our perceptions, and why real change starts with dismantling outdated norms. As a longtime advocate for women in aviation and co-founder of the New Track Scholarship, Lola emphasizes the importance of role models and allies in male-dominated fields. And if that wasn't inspiring enough, her memoir, Highway to the Sky, An Aviator's Journey, has already made waves. On International Women's Day this year, it reached Amazon's Aviation and Nautical Bio's top chart. Her book is currently number 38 and climbing faster on the charts than I can even keep up with at this time of recording. What a fitting milestone on International Women's Day for a woman who has spent her life breaking ceilings in the sky. If you ever felt like you didn't belong in a space designed to keep you out, this episode is for you. Lola's journey is proof that persistence, passion, and community can break even the highest of glass ceilings. You may hear mentions of her overcoming an abusive relationship throughout this interview. You'll catch the first part of this interview in October for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss out on it. Now let's get right into the call. As a reminder, you can watch this video over on Spotify or YouTube.
My parents were wonderful parents in that they were kind and thoughtful and did lots of things for me and with me. They were more like nannies, like a sort of the British nanny or an au pair, because neither of them actually wanted children. I had great grandparents who, by the way, wanted grandchildren and wanted children. So my grandfather is probably the reason am as successful as I am, because he was just so supportive and so encouraging. And I spent many years with him, many months, camping, traveling. They were my babysitters, so it was great. But I knew that there was something wrong at home, at my parents' home, but I didn't know what. They were very distant generally and cold and critical, and nothing was ever good enough. So I had that kind of insecurity, which is probably why I leapt into marriage in the first place, not fully knowing my husband.
Not having that example, too, of what you needed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I had an example of my grandfather, but that was really quite different and a very different relationship. And I don't think they fully realized the dynamics of my home life. That is, their daughter, my mother, and her husband, my father. I don't think they fully realized it. Because again, appearances. My mother was very concerned with appearances. I went figure skating and I wasn't very good at it, but I did baton and tap. And my sister took piano lessons and went figure skating and we traveled. It seemed like a pretty wonderful life. And in many ways it was. There aren't many kids when they're 7 years old go flying. I mean, not in 1962 anyway. Today we hop on airplanes and away we go. But getting on an airplane in 1962 was absolutely epic. It was astonishing and it changed my life.
How did stepping into a male-dominated industry empower you while healing from an abusive relationship?
I'm not sure it did. It made me tough, that's for sure. It empowered me. I had some supportive colleagues, and that was instrumental, obviously, in my success and in believing in myself. But with aviation, you're tested at various stages, private license, commercial license. And with each of those, instrument rating, multi-engine rating, various tests, and these are physical tests, and then there are written tests, and then you have annual tests once you get hired commercially. Each one of these is very empowering. Just going solo at 12 to 15 hours is really empowering. It's like, think about, do you drive a car? Yeah. So think about, first time you drive a car, it's like, wow, this is amazing, this big hunk of steel, and I'm actually driving it. And then you pass your driver's test. Maybe you have to drive a boat or a motorcycle. All of these are all really empowering. And so it's step by step, going to university, going to college, taking night courses that are for credit. Every single thing is empowering. So I had the same qualifications as my male pilots. And this is a big topic, right, these days. But if you're flying an airplane commercially, you have been tested by the same people, the same organizations, to the same standards. Yes, there is a person testing you if in the actual flight test. There is a person physically observing you. There's usually a co-pilot and the examiner. So it's not just one person alone in a cockpit. In other words, if you mess up, it's not just the examiner who's going to see it. So you've been tested, and each of these are empowering, and you take that with you to a job. So I certainly had some detractors who said things like, boobs don't belong in a cockpit. They call it a cockpit, not a pussy pit. Even inside the cockpit on a one-to-one, or the flight deck on a one-to-one, some of the guys, not all of them, a couple of them, would treat me just a little bit differently in that they constantly scrutinized me. I found that one of the most difficult things. So if a man is hired, regardless of the profession, if a man is hired, there's that tacit assumption that he is qualified. And if he makes a couple mistakes, it's like, oh, he had a bad day. It's the converse happens with women. They're assumed to not quite be competent, even though they passed all those same tests. And so when you make a mistake, and spoiler alert, I made mistakes, that was racked up as, well, look at that. Women can't fly airplanes. Look, she just made that mistake. So there's not as much acceptance of minor errors. It wasn't like I drove a plane in the ground. We're talking minor errors that are not as easily overlooked because of that social conditioning. Because the guys I worked with, their wives or their girlfriends, their parents, their mothers, their grandmothers were not professional women. Their wives or girlfriends might work outside the home. And I realize working inside the home is a lot of work. It totally is. But it is different in that none of their wives or girlfriends were professionals. They might work at the dress shop or the bakery or the checkout clerk. Nothing wrong with any of those professions, but those were done more for extra money for the home as opposed to personal fulfillment. So they couldn't quite understand. One of the guys also could not understand why I left my husband. And did I leave my husband? And why did I not have a boyfriend? Well, isn't a bad husband better than no husband? I think that attitude has changed a lot, I hope, because a bad husband is definitely not a good husband to have around. But he was absolutely astonished that a woman, this again was 1979, that a woman would leave a man. And so I asked him if he was afraid his wife might leave him. And that stopped that conversation. But they just didn't know how to deal with me. They'd never met a female pilot before. I'd never met a female pilot. They'd never met a female pilot. So it was very different. It was a learning experience, I think, for all of us. Was it empowering? There were days I didn't want to go to work, the scrutiny by a couple of the guys, not all of them. There were other days it was absolutely fabulous. And actually, one of the more memorable flights I had in a positive note was with my worst detractor. And it was just the greatest flight ever. We didn't have any passengers on that particular leg. It was way up north, and we went down to about, I don't know, 1,000 feet above ground, and we found this pack of wolves. And we didn't go down further, but we just followed along and watched them loping into the forest. It was just spectacular. And for that few moments, he was a different person. So I think I tried to, at least when writing the book, remember how I felt during those times and realize that I had baggage and so did they. And they were a product of the same environment I was. I wasn't born in World War II, but our parents were. And that's when women did work as civilian volunteers in World War II to help the war effort. But after the war was over, they were sent back home where they belonged. And that was still a prevailing attitude. My own grandfather, when I told him I was leaving my job at the bank, was quitting my job at the bank, he seemed not too happy. And I thought he was worried for my safety. He grew up in the era of the barnstormers at the beginning of the era of flight. And he said, oh, no, 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 it's not that. It's just you'll be taking jobs from men who need to feed their families. It's like, Grandpa, you need to feed my family. Remember me? You have a grandson. I have a son. The good news is, seconds later, we did this on the phone, and seconds later, I couldn't say anything. I was speechless. But I also knew that he was 85 years old, and he was born when, let me see, I guess there were automobiles, but they weren't around where we lived. So in his lifetime, it went from no automobiles to breaking the sound barrier. I mean, things had really changed during this man's life. And so said nothing. And then I hear these tears, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just an old man. I know you'll be, fly safe and, best wishes." And so he still had my back, which was great. But if my own grandfather, whom I adore and who adores me, thinks that, guess what everybody else is going to think? So it's difficult. And it wasn't just the guys I worked with. It was passengers who were shocked. Where's the pilot? Did you just borrow that uniform? If I was loading baggage, because at some of the remote areas we'd have to load bags, we didn't have ramp crews. The passengers would try and actually take the bags from my hand and say that I shouldn't be doing that. And yet it's my job. And they were not being unkind. They just genuinely wanted to help because I wasn't capable of doing that. That's what they were saying, right? So you have to take everything in the context of what's happening in the larger world. Not once, no matter what anybody ever did to me, I never took it personally. And I think that's a really big thing. Think about what's happening in that person's life. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does help to understand how they got to where they are, what's happening today. Maybe they did have a really bad day at work. Let's talk about it.
Can you let me know the percentages of male commercial pilots versus female commercial pilots?
The most recent statistics are that 4.7% of the world's commercial pilots are females, which is pretty dismal. When I started, it was about 2.5% to 3%. It went up to about 6%. It's gone down a little bit, which is a little bit distressing. Not everybody wants to be a pilot, right? I mean, the percentage of men who want to be pilots is fairly small in the general population. Not everybody wants to be a pilot. They might say, "Oh, it'd be great to go fly an airplane," but they don't really want to be a pilot. I think we need to encourage more women. We need to be more visible. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to talk about what it's like being a female in a non-traditional role, what it's like being a female who wants to do something different. Not everybody does, but to encourage other women to think about it. Think about becoming an engineer, an aerospace engineer, an air traffic controller, police officer, a firefighter. I organized a career day for girls, and my focus was aviation because that's what I know. But because it was a girls in non-traditional roles day, I also invited the local firefighters and the local Ontario Provincial Police, and they sent their female firefighters and their female police so that little girls and their parents and little boys and big boys can see that women do these things. Because it's not just the women who need to understand that. So, for example, I'm actually coming to Denver for the Women in Aviation International Convention. And I love these conventions. They're fun, they're empowering, the camaraderie is spectacular. But we are preaching to the choir. We are, part of that 4.7% of commercial pilots who are female. So we need to be more visible in the community. So I love doing these podcasts. I'm doing a presentation with another female pilot at Tattered Cover on the Friday, the 28th, Erica Armstrong, who is from Colorado, which is pretty cool. We need to do presentations. So I do outreach presentations to service clubs, Kiwanis, Rotary, Probus, that's professional business groups, to schools, to libraries, I guess to anybody who'll listen. And I have an audiovisual presentation, and I talk about the first few female pilots and the World War II pilots, the first women in space, that just to be visible. And that there are female engineers, female air traffic controllers, females doing jobs that are traditionally not considered suitable for women. Early on, by the way, there were some viable restrictions. So, for example, the DC-3, most women couldn't fly the DC-3. It was, I think, built in 1933. And the reason was most women were not 5'7" or taller. So the control surfaces then did not move. That is, the rudder pedals, like think, accelerator, brake, the rudder pedals move closer to you. So you could sit on seat cushions and be, that way adjust your seat. But the pilot seat didn't move. The controls moved, but they were in a static position. They didn't come closer to you. So unless you were, a very tall woman, you couldn't fly that airplane. So they've made adjustments that way. So initially, some of the rules were not unreasonable. But the woman I'm actually speaking with, Erica Armstrong, she wrote Chick in a Cockpit, and her story is sort of the flip-flop of mine. She was a commercial pilot. She was successful. She met this great guy, and little by little, he eroded at confidence, control of her finances, and made her feel so much a failure that she actually stopped flying for some time. It's sort of the absolute opposite of mine. It's ironic that happened. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation about how that happened for her and what she eventually did about it and got out of that abusive relationship as well. I think the other thing I mentioned about writing this book, so many of us don't really want to talk about being abused. Somehow it's our fault, right? Because we're told that.
Mhm.
It's your fault, and I'm going to make you pay. It's not your fault. And so we need to talk about that and realize that we women are people in our own rights. And yes, we're not islands and we do need other people, but we don't need other people who make us feel less than we know we are, intrinsically know we are.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm also curious how the language is in a male dominated industry. I worked in a shop on cars for a while, and I know some of the language was pretty outdated. And I'm curious from your perspective how that language, because I know it can impact you, words have weight. And
Yeah, in Canada and most other countries in the world, when you get a private pilot license or a commercial pilot license, it's called pilot license. In America, it's called an airman license. I think that's a big issue. I mean, there are other things that are perhaps more pressing. I'm not saying that we should all run out and change all our language, but language does inform us and it is important. And that's why we no longer say fireman or policeman, serviceman, garbage man. I mean, occasionally we'll hear it, right? But it's really not in the vernacular anymore. And yet airman is still on the license. And I personally am glad that I have a pilot license that takes gender away from my profession. Our language is important. And I do mention that in my presentations that it's an example of still the macho attitude that really does exist. Interestingly enough, I have a girlfriend who was in the Canadian military, and she makes my experience look like a good day at kindergarten. And so I cannot speak. That's for her to tell her story. And she's actually in the process of so doing. But in many cases, the military would be difficult too. I'm curious, what kind of language did you hear at the car shop?
yeah, I had a couple people who would challenge me and my knowledge, and I would have to
Ah,
get a man to say the same thing just because he didn't trust it from me.
wow, I believe it.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, isn't it?
No, I agree. I used to kind of have fun though, challenging it and just, like I knew my work and I knew what I was doing and I found it kind of fun to see the doubt in somebody's eyes and to be able to change it and
Yes.
give them a different perspective. Like I could see it and then by the end of it they'd be more confident and kind of like, "Oh, I guess she's got this."
That's awesome.
Yeah, I enjoyed that challenge definitely. Where else did you run into issues with being a woman in a male dominated industry?
Well, we talked generally about the public, the guys. As I got more and more experience, obviously people would react to me differently because I was then experienced. I had quite a number, several thousand hours. I had experience. I was a supervisor. Was training. I was an examiner. So the perception does change. But it's kind of funny, really. If I did occasionally go out with the guys, I was always assumed to be like the secretary or the office staff or the stewardess, or now called flight attendant. So, again, a traditional female role. There were many guys who clearly were not interested in chatting further with a female pilot. Some were dubious, but others were perfectly fine. I mean, as I said, I didn't have any trouble finding boyfriends. Some of them were pilots too. So, not the guys I worked with, but they were pilots as well. Just want to clarify that. But I really, I guess, didn't do a lot of socialization at the time. I was working full time, but full time as a pilot would be 40 to 50 hours of flight time a month. Now, that also doesn't include getting the airplane ready, waiting at various airports for passengers. So I did work more than that, but it was flexible. And I also had my son to look after, and certainly we had joint custody. So it wasn't a full-time occupation or custodial arrangement. But I also managed to go to university again through correspondence. And so I was able to take the courses with me. So I was a busy person. I didn't do a lot of socialization other than at work. And then I also taught part time. So I met some of the guys that I dated where I was teaching part time. They were great, actually. I think given the time period, most people were fairly receptive. And some were pretty excited to see a female pilot. It was certainly a rarity. In the time that I was flying commercially, I met one female instructor while I was doing my flight training, and she's still a friend of mine. But then she got out of it and she became a lawyer. She could not stand the misogyny. It just drove her crazy. And then during my career, I knew of three female pilots, but I never met them. But in addition to those three that I never met, there were four that I encountered occasionally, but we were all stationed at different airports, so I rarely saw them. Occasionally, or more typically, I might hear them on the airwaves. It was kind of lonely, I guess, more than anything. So I just kept myself busy with dating and my son and working on my university degree.
Good, healthy outlet. I know you have 5 tips to navigate being a woman in a male-dominated industry. Are you willing to share those with me?
For sure. Well, be confident. Sometimes you have to, like, maybe you're not feeling quite as confident as you should be and you deserve to be, but you have to at least appear confident, be courageous, seek allies. That's really important. And you don't know who those allies are going to be. For example, just because there are other female colleagues, so although I only ever worked with one female colleague near the very end of my career, they may not be your friend. I mean, just because they're in the same occupation, that's what you have in common, but you may find allies in the unlikeliest places, perhaps. So, what did I say? Be confident, be courageous, seek allies, believe in yourself. That's really important. It's a lot like being confident, but not quite the same way. And believe in yourself in the sense of if you've done all the training and you've passed the flight test or passed the exams, whatever your career is, you have as much right to be there. And it's rarely the same person, by the way, in aviation that tests you. So I was tested by a variety of people, again, with what's going on, particularly these days with women in aviation and our right to be there challenged. So I had two different flight schools. And then I had an examiner for my private flight test, and he was in Barrie. And then my commercial flight test was in Waterloo. So totally different examiner for my instructor rating. That was from Transport Canada. They were all different than the previous one. Every year I had to have a multi-engine flight test and an instrument rating. But it's a different person every year. So if there's a problem, somebody's going to pick it up somewhere along the line. Yes, maybe it's possible that somebody might say, oh, he's a female, maybe I better go easy on her or whatever. The next person might not, and they might do exactly the opposite. They might swing the other way and think, ooh, I better make sure I test her really, really well because I don't want anybody to say, oh, I passed her because she's female. Right. So there's so many different tests in so many different areas by so many different people at different levels. I find it absolutely ridiculous to think that there's any man or woman flying that doesn't deserve to be there because they've been tested by so many different individuals in different areas. There's actually a couple more, really. Be authentic. I never tried to be a male pilot. I never wanted to be a male pilot. I never wanted to be a female pilot. I just wanted to be a pilot. I did rebel against wearing a tie because, one, they're really uncomfortable. And interestingly enough, I had to have my suit tailor made. The guys could go down to the shop where they bought men's suits. And so I had to have mine made with the same cloth. And I went down to the tailor shop, and that's kind of cool. And they just sewed the stripes on, obviously. But it's still pretty amazing. And then there's actually another one, strive for excellence. And it depends on how you look. That's actually 6 tips, but that's all right. Strive for excellence. And I originally when I wrote this as an article, I wrote strive for perfection. And in speaking on another podcast, actually, she said, the thing with women is that we want to be perfect. We know that we have to really do our work better than I might have to do it. But at what point do we stop? Is it good enough? Or, I mean, there's good enough, there's, excellence. And we want to do the best job we can. But on the other hand, you'll never get to be perfection, but strive for excellence. And I think that's really important and perhaps important for women too. I think so many women now know that if there's a job opening, a guy will say, oh, I can do 5 out of 6 of those things. And I've never really had experience with that, but apply anyway, good, it's not going to hurt. Whereas a woman will go, ooh, I don't have all those qualifications. I better not apply for that. Whereas it's along the same lines of strive for excellence. Yes, you want to strive for excellence. You want to be the best you can be, but you also have to just take that first step and go for it.
I love that. Thank you for that. And the bonus tip. I am curious. growing up, what kind of messages you were sent about women being in positions like this and how that impacted you as a girl and then also as an adult going into this field?
I always wanted to fly. At age 7, it was just an epic event. Nobody else I knew all through public school and maybe until late high school. I only knew one other guy that had been on an airplane. So it wasn't like today. There weren't budget airlines. You couldn't just hop on a plane and, be in the Bahamas or Mexico. People just didn't travel that way. And the media actually influenced me. I had two favorite shows. I mean, yeah, I watched cartoons like all kids did. My two favorite shows, and I watched them both on reruns. One was Sky King, and the other was Sea Hunt. They're old, old shows. And I've watched a couple of them. You can get a couple of them on YouTube now. So Sea Hunt was about scuba diving, and the lead character was Lloyd Bridges, who's the father of Beau Bridges and Jeff Bridges, both very famous. And he was a very exciting man, and he was a scuba diver. And I thought, well, I grew up and became a professional scuba diver too. That wasn't really on the list of things I'd wanted to do, and yet it was back there, right? Somehow, yeah, it was implanted in my mind. And then Sky King was named after the man, the protagonist, Skylar King, who flew a twin engine Piper around Arizona. And he would help the police, and he would find people who were lost or save people. And he had a niece who also took all the same flight tests that he did, and she was a licensed pilot, but she rarely flew. So I kind of got two messages there that yes, women could fly airplanes, but only if the man was not available or was somehow incapacitated. But the fact that she was in there at all was absolutely remarkable. And somehow, again, it wasn't a conscious decision, but it definitely impacted me.
So, both of us being parents, what advice would you give to parents, especially those of girls, to help make changes in gender roles at home to break this cycle of
Oh.
encouraging or discouraging specific genders pursuing careers?
Well, one of it is buy stuff that's encouraging. So, for example, I just happen to have Captain Barbie here, and you can get all kinds of Barbie dolls these days that are, when I played with Barbie, and yes, I played with Barbie, she had wedding dresses and house dresses and aprons, and she could look pretty glamorous, but I didn't have anything that suggested that Barbie might have responsibilities outside the home. And so now you can get pediatrician Barbie, who comes with two tiny little twins, Dr. Barbie, all kinds of things. So I think media. So for me, the media was super influential, although I didn't realize it. The other thing I guess was influential when I was a kid was National Geographic and Time magazine and Life magazine, because I certainly grew up with a lust for travel, which my parents encouraged. But there are some children that will gravitate towards what we consider traditional, but not all of them. And I think just encouraging behaviors that are not gender specific. And yet, just last week, I heard a friend of mine was talking about her young son and some behavior he was doing. And she said, oh, he's just a typical boy. And I was quite shocked at that, actually. His behavior was not atypical for a child, nor was it offensive. There was nothing wrong with it. But I thought that kind of behavior was stuff I did. Right? I mean, I played in the sandbox with boys. I did not play doctor and nurse ever. That didn't interest me, but I played with trucks and, I built stuff, mechano, encourage that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of toys. Oh, and there is a fabulous website called Mighty Girl.
Yes, I am subscribed to that. I have two sons.
The
So
toys are great, and you don't buy for listeners or what people watching. You don't buy from that site. You can buy. It says where to buy. It's Amazon.com or Amazon.ca or a local independent store. It's fabulous. So it's this collective of all these great toys and books, science toys, building toys. Fabulous stuff for all ages and really for all genders, even though it's called Mighty Girl, because we're focusing on getting girls involved in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. It's a fabulous site. I highly recommend it to listeners.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think, on the opposite, I know I asked about girls in particular, but I think it's important for boys, young boys, to see these things too. We've got Barbies and we've got books about powerful women and we watch shows with female leads. You know, there are male leads in some of them too, but I try to really be diverse with that so they aren't limited in their beliefs of what other girls and women can do as well.
Right. I mean, now looking back, Mary Tyler Moore was a radical TV show, and yet was very inspirational to a lot of women. Yeah, I bought some of these for boys as well, from Mighty Girl, from the Mighty Girl site. I bought for boys because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the attitudes of mothers, women, and mothers and girls we have to change. It's a whole social sea change that needs to recognize women are just as capable than men. For example, the plane does not know whether you're male or female. It has no idea. The only reason men are considered more competent as pilots, if they are considered more competent as pilots, the only reason was that that's just who did the jobs outside the home. It wasn't that women weren't considered competent, they just weren't even considered. In fact, when Tom Wolfe wrote the book The Right Stuff about the Mercury astronaut program, at that time, it was assumed that the only people that had the right stuff, and I think it was from 1958 to 1963, were white males. Nobody else needed to apply because white males were clearly the only ones that had the right stuff,
Yeah, that's wild.
which is ridiculous,
Yeah.
obviously. I just want to point that out, but that was the assumption at the time. And he wrote that in the 70s, I believe, that the program was 58 to 63.
So, how has it been for you watching that transition, that belief transition away from that, and now almost shifting back into that?
There's a lot of that in the media, for sure. The competence of women is being challenged, and it's being challenged because of DEI and the repeal of DEI in many industries, in many businesses. But as I mentioned earlier, at least with female pilots, there are so many different stages of training and evaluation by different people. I mean, it might be the same organization. So in Canada, it's Transport Canada, in American, it's Federal Aviation Authority, and they have appointed, there's a hierarchy of individuals who are approved for flight testing. Individual companies will have their own chief pilots and flight training officers, but there's so many levels of evaluation. There's certainly been a lot of activity on Facebook pages for women, and a lot of anger, and they felt a lot of personally being challenged. So there's a lot of pushback from female pilots as well, saying, hey, we've done all the training. The training we've done is equal to that of guys and so many different people. And I think that really has to be emphasized, because not just that we've been evaluated by so many different people. The equivalent would be going through primary school and secondary school and being tested by the same person the whole way. We know that doesn't happen. And no, unlike at least in Canada, where you can kind of be pushed through primary school if, let's say, you're not doing well, so the teacher pushes you on to the next level. It's not going to happen in aviation. You're not going to get pushed on to the next level. Your competence builds on your initial training. I think it's very sad that we're having to defend ourselves. I think we were just making great strides in the STEM careers, and it's difficult being challenged. I know that I felt challenged for probably every day of my career, that someone was either intentionally challenging me or non-aggressively challenging me by simply saying, you're the pilot. We have to change as a society. I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did.
That's okay. If we had the answer, we would already be doing it. What advice would you give to a female in a male dominated industry right now that is getting pushed back for being, quote unquote, a DEI hire,
Mm,
not being competent
wow.
or capable enough? What advice would you give them to navigate that on their own?
Don't try to do it on your own. Don't try to do it on your own. I know that I was on my own and it was difficult. And I literally was on my own because we didn't have the internet yet. But seek allies. That's what you really absolutely need to do. Seek allies in your company, seek allies in other companies, reach out to these Facebook groups, and women certainly are doing that. But doing it alone is very difficult. But you still have to be confident and believe in yourself. I mean, You have as much right to be there as anybody else, but don't do it on your own. You will need allies, that's for sure.
As soon as I asked that, I realized that that was already in your 5 tips.
That's okay. No problem. We need to hear that again. The woman I mentioned earlier who had a career in the military, if more men were like her dad, and I kept saying, well, why was he so different? I mean, he was empowering, he was encouraging. I've seen in many cases, so say, for example, with the major airlines, when I said earlier, we need to have role models. We need to have role models so that people can say, well, look, she's doing that or he's doing that. Well, if she's doing that, I can do that. And that's very important to have that role model. I don't know what this woman's father, where his role model was, but I do find that, say, for example, you have a male pilot, when they have children, whether they're boys or girls, somehow there's that shift there. And they want their children to have a better life. And perhaps they want their children to be pilots or doctors or engineers. And they then have a little bit of an awakening and realize I want my daughter to fly with me in the airplane or to fly for the same company I fly for. And I think in many cases we have more men who come to that realization that their daughter is super smart.
Thank you so much for your time. I think that this conversation is very relevant and is going to be very empowering.
I've had a great time.
I'm glad that we met.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if you're around, but I'm going to be at the Tattered Cover event on March 28th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. at Aspen Grove with Erica Armstrong. It'll be nice to meet you. I totally understand if it's not possible, but maybe some of your listeners will. But here are the two books. There's Erica's, The Chick in the Cockpit, and Highway to the Sky.
Thank you for showing those as well. It has been an absolute pleasure getting to know you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you so much for being here with me for another episode of Bloomera Podcast. You'll get a chance to hear more about Lola and her journey overcoming domestic violence, reclaiming her self-worth, and building this incredible life for herself. Her episode will be featured in October for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. As a survivor of domestic violence myself, it is a very important month for me, and I hope you will tune into it. And if you happen to be in the Denver area and listening to this as it's published, you can catch Lola at the annual Women in Aviation International Conference on March 27th through the 29th. You can find all of that info and ways to connect with Lola in the episode description. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming exciting interviews that I have for you. I will see you in the next episode.